Popper's first etude is all about the bouncing bow on the cello. And there's even the instructions at the very beginning with a very loose wrist at the nut, lightly staccato. And that's our goal for this whole piece, to keep a loose bow hand and to make this gentle spiccato stroke. There's a couple of difficulties that enter in here. For one thing, the piece is in triplets. And of course our bow only goes down bow and up bow in two directions. So there's every beat, the bow stroke is the note, the bow stroke on the beat is the opposite of the beat before. So bowing issues in triplets, that's an issue right there. It's just that we don't have a down bow on every beat. An even bigger issue in this etude is all of the string crossings. That's partly why we need a very loose wrist, so that when we do a string crossing, it can be with the smaller part of our bow machinery rather than crossing strings with the big part of our bow machinery. So a lot of the times, even though I'm crossing strings, the big part of my arm stays neutral. I didn't say still, because I don't want us to have a stiff bow arm, but it stays neutral. And then the action is this kind of wheel that's in our wrist and hand. Now all of these string crossings do cause us to stiffen up a little in our bow hand. So a big goal, after like some of the extreme jumps, is to remind ourselves just to let go and let go of that grip. The big string crossings cause us to grip. And so after the big string crossings, find your repose and find the opportunity to let go of the extra bow grip. For example, here I feel like I can let go of my bow and get back to a more relaxed way of playing. Now there are some times where we want to change our bow stroke a little for musical reasons, because if we just play the same staccato all the way through, it gets a little boring. Even though there is a staccato dot over every note, we'll make some musical inflections. Almost like when playing a Bach suite, we'll stretch bass notes. And it's the same thing here. We'll use a little different bow stroke to bring out bass notes. Now I don't think we should bring out those bass notes by adding extra time. That interrupts the flow of the piece. See, that interrupts the flow of the piece. I think there are a few spots where we can actually stretch the time, but we have to pick those spots carefully and just make sure they are at the important spots in the piece. So without changing the time, how will we make some notes sound more important? It's either going to be with weight of bow or with speed of bow, how much bow we use. And it's a little combination of both. When I play those bass notes, I let my bow sink into the string just a little more than on the other notes. And plus, I give it a little zoom of bow speed. And so it's about feeling the different importance of the different notes. They're all important, that we play well and represent well, but they aren't all equally important. They all don't have the same function. So bring out the bass notes. And even right here in the first measure is an example of I think, 3 levels of importance. Bass note important, and then there's this downward scale, which leads to the next bass note. I like to bring out those scale notes. So I think the bass notes are most important, the scale notes are secondary importance, and then the high note is the 3rd level of importance. I try to play the highest notes the lightest. And now you can't exaggerate this too much, it would sound funny, and you can't take time, as I just did, to show which note was important and which was less. But if you can incorporate this idea of different levels of importance, it makes the etude have a charm and a nice musicality. And here, same thing. Feel what you, decide what you feel is important. Especially here, where the harmonic action speeds up. I put an important sounding bow stroke on every beat. Notice how in the first 4 measures, the harmony changes once per measure. In the 5th and 6th measure, it changes twice per measure. And then here in measure 7, it changes every beat. So even though the notes are all triplet 8th notes, there's kind of an acceleration in the musical action. And this happens all the time in our music, so it's good to feel it in our etudes also. Jumping ahead, well, here's a great example of how the bottom notes, before we jump ahead, the bottom notes are more important to bring out than the high notes. It's fun to bring out those bottom notes. Now there's a few spots in this piece where it's just hard to hear, and so having a good understanding of the harmonies is important. I'm going to jump ahead to measure 16. I'm going to go slow, no bouncing. So it's really helpful if we understand what the harmonies are, because very often there's just 1 or 2 harmonies in a measure. So if we learn the piece by harmonies, there's less to learn than if we learn 12 notes in every measure. So right there at measure 16, one of the important things for me in my hearing of the piece, the 3rd beat of measure 16 and the 4th beat of measure 16 are the same harmony. Popper loves his diminished chords and diminished sevenths, and that's what we have here. Both the 3rd beat and the 4th beat are that harmony. So they have to sound well together. And another item, just speaking of hearing and intonation, make sure that your F sharps agree. The low F sharp and the high F sharp, make sure they agree. And then in the next measure, measure 17, it's the same thing. 2 beats of the same harmony. And then he goes away from his diminished chord to an A minor chord. So for hearing, really associate those groups of notes. And then it's the same thing, just down a half step. And then a little different chord. Now technically, what let's do here is keep fingers down. I keep 2 and 1 down all the time. I shift with both fingers down. Now I don't keep them down hard. I don't keep them really stuck to the string. When I make the shift, I lighten the weight, but still I keep both fingers down, just for economy of effort. And here we have these big string crossings. I mentioned earlier about how our hand works in circles, almost like a wheel. And so use that here as much as you can. Because there's such a big angle from where our bow is on the C string to where it is on the A string, that if you do that with your arm, ooh, lots of effort that you don't want to make. So that's why get close to the frog and let that flexible wheel in your wrist and hand and fingers do as much of the work as possible. This is such a big string jump, you will have to do some work from your arm and shoulder, but make that as little as possible and do as much as possible here. Now here's the section with some left hand challenges, these big leaps. The first one is kind of easy to make the leap because it's going from open A, so we have time. But from A to B flat, our ear, that's not the first thing our ear guesses will happen. So make sure that you hear well. And then I mentioned how Popper likes his diminished chords. That's what these are. That after you leap to the high note, you're coming down diminished chords that just shift down a half step every beat. So hear that as a chord, down a half step. This is all one chord, down a half step. That's all one chord. So for ear training, make sure that you hear these diminished sevenths going down. That's kind of what the harmonies are doing, diminished chords that just slide down a half step. Technically here, again, let's go for economy of effort. Let's keep fingers down. I like to keep my 1 and 2 down. And it's the exact same thing as we had earlier, only here we're shifting backwards. Keep 1 and 2 down, maybe not super hard, because then you get stuck and it's effortful to make the shifts. Keep them down, but just with a little, and you can see how your arm helps with the shift. Arm is always involved in good shifting. And so it's like that little arm loop that lightens the weight on your hand so you can make a good shift. And now the leaps are harder because you're not going from an open string, but they're easier to hear because now you're leaping an octave. And this is a hard hand position on the cello. It's a half step space between first and second finger and a whole step space between 2 and 3. It's easy for this to sort of, for second finger to get pulled sort of halfway in between, and then we don't have good intonation. So make that, to me, the answer is make the whole step space between 2 and 3, just keep it as big as possible and keep 2 then pushed back against first finger. In fact, I noticed now when I make my shift, I actually keep all my fingers down. Sorry. And then the same thing for the one that goes shifting from D to D. So it's these diminished chords that just go parallel down the cello. And then that leads us into and after all of those diminished harmonies, thank goodness, now we have just plain old minor and major chords. I have trouble in here. Sometimes I get little squeaky sounds. And I don't think it's my bow's fault always. It's an easy thing for your left hand to be responsible for squeaks. And you know why I think it is? Because if our thumb is down, and if our third finger goes down slowly, the cello string thinks we're trying to play a false harmonic. So one of my goals in these measures in this thumb position is that my finger goes fast to the fingerboard, so that there's that 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch between the string and the fingerboard, and I make sure that my finger goes through that 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch fast, so that my cello doesn't try to play a harmonic. 4 measures of nice, clear major and minor chords. Popper goes back to his diminished sevens. Same harmony, down a whole step. Down another whole step. And then a chromatic scale until he gets to G. G is the dominant of C, and that's what key this etude is in. So he's gotten at G as the dominant of the recap, which comes up in just about 4 measures. So from measure 32, which is second measure of the top line, if you have the same addition I do. Again, it's our friend diminished 7. But it's not just the harmony notes. Popper uses passing notes. The D is a passing note to C, and C and A are part of the harmony. So in that first measure, the harmony is passing note, harmony, passing note, harmony, passing note, harmony, passing note to the next new harmony. We talked earlier about making some notes sound more important and some notes less important. Here's another case in point. Make the scale sound a little more important. And let the high note be in a softer voice. Since the high note's on the A string, it's going to naturally want to come out anyway. So if we were playing piano, we would say put the soft pedal on it. Put the soft pedal on that high note. Sorry. And a good tip for how to practice this to really clarify the intonation is to use double stops. So play a double stop of the harmony notes so that you really hear it the way you want to, clearly and perfectly in tune. Play the passing note to the next double stop. Practice it to make sure that your intonation is just as good as it can be. Now there's one other little peculiar difficulty in these measures. That's what the notes do. They just go down at the end of the measure. Last 2 notes to the downbeat are just a little 3-note chromatic scale. But we have to be sure to jump to the D string for the downbeat of the next measure to be in position for the new passage. And with this jump, it's easy to lose our intonation. But just make sure that you hear the simple 3 notes of a chromatic scale. Hear that well in your ear, and then just make that last note exactly that easy and in tune. But jumping to the D string. And so this it's just pretty much a copy and paste from the beginning. Some variations in dynamics, but all of the same passage work, and so all of the same technical issues for our left hand and for our bow. And then it makes a change in measure 58, the last measure of the 3rd line up from the bottom. and then we stay in C major to go to the end. It's another passage with these big jumps. Do as much as you can in your hand and as little as possible in the shoulder. And a key idea is that you have to be close to the frog. Look how little effort I have to make to go from A string, from C string to A string. If I'm close to the frog, almost no shoulder. But if I'm out in the middle of the bow, there's a lot more effort. So be close to the frog, and then try to make these bass notes ring out almost like you have a bell that you're hitting. So those are some ideas I have about Popper's Etude No. 1 from the High School of Cello Playing, and I hope they help you out. Have fun working on this etude.